So my name's Niki, and I was involved in setting up and now work for Primary. Primary is an art space located within a former Victorian primary school in Nottingham. Primary officially opened in 2012, and that was the result of a number of different explorations of different sites. The location that we're based within at this moment in time was not our first choice, and it wasn't our second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. I don't know how far back I could go. So I thought that in relation to the kind of framing of this, I thought it would be interesting to kind of talk about some of the dead ends and kind of failures that kind of happened along the way to kind of securing the site. And depending on how long I kind of talk about those, I might also talk about what is happening now. Between 2005 and 2012, we explored lots of different options in relation to building buildings from scratch, completely renovating buildings that were in state of disrepair, buying buildings, leasing buildings. So all of these options were explored across time. And the kind of changing situation that we found ourselves within Nottingham, but also in a kind of wider kind of artistic context, but also in a wider kind of financial context that occurred across that kind of period of time, also affected the kind of decisions that were taken as we kind of developed. In the kind of notes, it talks about new approaches to studio provision beyond simply thinking about kind of cheap rent. So I also thought it was perhaps relevant to note that I have also done that option as well in terms of when I graduated from a fine art course in Nottingham, and within the kind of 2 months of kind of leaving university, I tried to secure the kind of cheapest possible space that I could find in Nottingham. So I took on the top floor of this kind of factory building, and I think paid around £200 a month for the entire kind of floor. It wasn't strictly a kind of studio space in that it was more of a collaborative space that involved an ongoing kind of events program. We had that building we paid on a kind of monthly rolling basis, so there was zero kind of security in relation to that. But we did end up spending 2 years in the building before it was knocked down to make way for a car park. And then I repeated the same thing of taking on another building, so the top floor of this kind of building, which was even cheaper. I think we paid £120 a month for that, and we actually stayed there for probably kind of 10 years. So although we again had no security, it kind of lasted kind of longer. But I think that we were aware that there were kind of issues around that, not only in relation to kind of the lack of security, but the lack of quality of the kind of space that we were kind of inhabiting. This building was truly awful in many kind of respects in terms of when we moved into it, there had been a fire in the building. It was not kind of watertight in any way, absolutely freezing, as most people will be kind of familiar with. So kind of burst pipes every kind of winter, etc., etc. So there were numerous kind of issues with it, and that was an issue across the kind of city. There was no studio space in Nottingham at that particular moment in time that was secure in the long term, or that was of any kind of reasonable kind of quality to kind of seriously consider kind of investing in, or kind of thinking that that was a kind of long-term option in relation to what you're doing. I had a conversation with 3 other artists based in the city in around 2004, 2005 about this kind of issue that we were all facing in different kind of circumstances. So I didn't particularly have any kind of working affiliation with these other artists. It was simply that they represented different groups across the city who were each facing the same problems and were interested in exploring options to kind of resolve those. we basically decided that we were going to try and resolve that by securing a building in the city that was owned by artists and that was secure in the long term. So that was our initial kind of intention. We had conversations with Arts Council around that and were initially kind of supported through kind of what was called managed funds at that particular moment in time. So we did not apply for money. They decided that what we were describing filled a gap in relation to what they were kind of thinking about. I think that they acknowledged at the time that obviously in 2004-05 it was kind of the height of capital investment through Arts Council, that within their kind of strategy it highlighted artist workspace as a priority, and yet there was nothing in the East Midlands region that kind of met that kind of goal. So I guess it was kind of fortuitous in the sense that we approached them with an idea and it kind of addressed something that they were not kind of delivering in relation to what they kind of talked about. And because we put forward that idea, we were encouraged to make a large-scale kind of capital application. So before we even had identified a site, formally kind of constituted as an organisation, we were simply four artists who lived in the city and had this kind of conversation. We were encouraged to make an application for kind of large-scale capital. So we attempted to do that in a very, very short time. I think from that initial meeting to submitting the application was probably a 6-month kind of process. So we identified a site, put together kind of some initial kind of plans for how that would kind of work, and made the application. And perhaps unsurprisingly, that was unsuccessful in the sense that we were up against various organisations that had been kind of putting together their plan for several, if not decades of kind of years. So the organisations that got it in that round would become Nottingham Contemporary, would become the New Art Exchange, would become the Curve kind of theatre in Leicester. So we were probably we were encouraged, but in some ways I wonder if we were always going to fail, and whether that was kind of problematic in terms of being kind of encouraged to kind of enter into it at that particular moment in time. But I guess it did provide the kind of stimulus to think about the reasons why we kind of failed and what it was that we were kind of lacking to kind of make a kind of convincing case around what was kind of required. So we applied to something called the Small Business Service, which I don't know whether that still exists anymore, but were awarded a kind of grant of around £15,000 to £20,000 to undertake basically a kind of feasibility study, which explored numerous kind of sites across the city and put together a kind of a range of kind of site options in relation to different things. So these are just some examples. There were numerous others. So some were kind of pre-existing buildings, some were kind of brownfield sites in the city. We even looked at kind of former kind of this council housing kind of block that had kind of fallen out of kind of use. So we explored a whole range of kind of different options, and we eventually in 2006-07 entered into a collaborative relationship with an organisation called New Deals for Communities, which I think was a nationwide in the sense that it existed across the country, but was specific to particular local areas that would be deemed to be suffering from kind of disadvantage in some way. They owned a building called Tennyson Hall, and it was relatively kind of derelict, and they were interested in supporting us to explore knocking that down and building again on that kind of site. So that led to a kind of partnership whereby the funding for this I think that is actually my computer. I will start on my computer again, but I will just talk without images for the time being. Okay. We had a site. We had a kind of a model in place for how this was going to be funded in relation to key support from New Deals for Communities, from Arts Council, and from Nottingham City Council around the kind of development of this kind of project. So all of those bodies supported us to develop the work through kind of architectural design. So we worked with David Adjay to develop a kind of a design for this location, and were generally kind of encouraged to think along those lines. And therefore we progressed this idea for a couple of years, only to find that then various things changed in the kind of context that we were kind of existing within. So New Deals for Communities changed in terms of the finance that it had from kind of national government and what its kind of priorities were. The kind of global financial crash happened. Arts Council quickly began to lower expectations about what it is that we should be kind of aiming to do. So it became quite clear that the option for new build wasn't as encouraged as it was a year or two before that. So and basically what happened with that site was that New Deals for Communities basically put the project on hold. So all the work that had been done over a couple of years became, to some extent, kind of redundant. Obviously, there are elements that can be kind of brought from that. So we then explored, rather than a new build option, we explored several options for kind of purchasing buildings within the kind of city. Two of which reached the kind of point of agreeing kind of terms of kind of sale and raising the money to kind of buy those buildings. Both of them were owned by the city council, and both of them actually fell through right at the kind of final kind of stage of those kind of negotiations. So the final one was basically because the city council departments had not been kind of speaking to each other. So the sale had been agreed, the price had been agreed, the terms of sale had been agreed, but they hadn't spoken to somebody else within kind of property or legal to do with the fact that the tenants in the building could not legally be removed. So we had to take them on if we were to buy the building, and the tenants didn't pay rent. So that obviously provided a kind of a problem with our kind of business kind of model for kind of using the site. So various kind of failures, maybe not on our own part, but because of being let down by other entities, resulted in the City Council deciding that they'd let us down on two previous occasions, and therefore they then offered us the building, which is primary, the building that we're in at the moment. Unfortunately, in the time that it took between having raised the money to buy the building and then them offering another building, some of the money was European money and had a kind of timeline attached to it, which meant that we had to kind of give the money back, which is something that is quite a particular, it's something that on a kind of individual level you never really experience. So that kind of, that feeling of having secured what is, you know, quite a massive amount of money thought about in kind of individual terms, to then have to hand it back because kind of time runs out on it was interesting. So when they offered us the building that we're in at this moment in time, we no longer had the money to purchase it, so we had to negotiate a lease agreement on the building. So what we did was we agreed a kind of 30-year lease on the property, and written into that is the option to kind of purchase it. So that is something that we're now currently kind of, I guess the whole process, where we started out in terms of what we wanted to achieve, has become a kind of staggered process. So a building has been secured, but we don't own it. It provides kind of studio space for now 45 artists, as well as other kind of creative entities, a bakery, various independent galleries. And we run a kind of program for the building. And now the kind of next stage is returning back to that idea of ownership of the building and also potentially capital development of the site, because there is the footprint of the site is much larger than the building that we're kind of currently occupying. Is that time up? I'll finish there.